Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg, the publisher of Orbis Books. Very glad to be joined today by a new Orbis author, Kate Common, who is an assistant professor of public and practical theology at Methodist Theological School in Ohio, and is the author of this fascinating new book called Undoing Conquest: Ancient Israel, the Bible, and the Future of Christianity. You may be, like me, someone who doesn't for pleasure read books on archaeology or biblical studies, but this is an absolutely fascinating book, and it begins with archaeology, begins with some reflections on information that's been known for 100 years by biblical scholars about what is called the Highland settlements in Canaan, which may represent the earliest origins of what became Israel. And what we learn from that archaeology is a picture of the origins of Israel that is very, very different from the familiar narrative in the Bible, the story told in the book of Joshua in particular, about the conquest of Canaan by the Hebrews who escaped from slavery in Egypt. And not only does this, challenge our understanding of the biblical story, but it also has all kinds of implications for the effective consequences of that story of conquest that have been played out in many places subsequently, especially in the United States, for example, the conquest of North America, territories of war with the indigenous people that was described as a kind of replay of this kind of conquest narrative, and in other places as well. So I'd like to welcome you, Kate. Very looking much forward to this conversation, and maybe you could walk us through a little bit of this foundation of your book. What were the Highlands Settlements, and what do we learn about this? How does it affect our understanding of the biblical story, and why that matters?
Thanks, Robert, for having me and for this conversation. I just want to start out by saying I didn't think I would ever be the type of person that would write a book on archaeology and biblical studies, let
Okay.
alone read one. So
Mm-hmm.
the story caught me by surprise. That is the story of the Highland Settlements. And let me just paint a picture for you. I was a first-year seminary student at Andover Newton Theological School way back in 2008. I had just left the corporate world. I was working as a graphic designer and art director in an ad agency near Boston. And I'm sitting in this Hebrew Bible class. And one day the professor starts talking about this archaeological evidence that, as you said, had been available, the research had been ongoing for around 100 years. And it was just sort of a blip in class, like, oh yeah, and also archaeological evidence reveals now that the origins of the Hebrew people emerged through sort of a social movement as an empire was collapsing, and it was really a peaceful movement that really challenges the story of conquest in the Bible. And moving on to sort of the next subject, and it was like a record screeching for me. I was like, what did you just say? Like, archaeology told us what? And it was from that moment on that I just sort of fell headfirst into this story and this narrative. And I just felt like this is a really big deal. These are stories coming from the biblical text when we're thinking about the story of conquest that have been with us for thousands of years and are really violent. And so on one hand, you have this origin story of conquest that describes the origins of Israel or the Hebrew people in Canaan as the result of a really violent genocide that God ordained, if you will. And as I get into it in the book, this story has had a long afterlife than the folks that originally wrote it. And under Christian sort of imperial rule and colonization around the globe, the story of conquest really became sort of a hallmark theological story to justify the colonization of many places, including the Americas, South Africa, And you see the story of conquest being leveraged today, still in places like South Africa, in the US, as I point out in my book. The Jericho March that took place on January 6th drew upon the conquest narrative as a way to challenge the election results in 2020. You see Benjamin Netanyahu leveraging the story of conquest to justify Israel's actions in Gaza. And so the story has lived on with really violent repercussions. And so the thought that there's a different story that's really one of justice, you could say, of peaceful origins, that completely counters this conquest narrative, and that it sort of sits behind the text, and it sits and it has been sort of unknown for thousands of years until really the last hundreds of years when last 100 years when archaeologists went into current Israel and Palestine and started digging up lots of new information. And that information really surprised them. The origins of sort of biblical archaeology, if you will, happened with the idea that now that we can dig in the Holy Land, we can prove all of the stories in the Bible. We should be able to go to Jericho and find evidence of the walls falling down and God's people there doing it. To the surprise of the archaeologists, they found evidence, especially like in Jericho, say, of walls falling down. Great, it proves the Bible. But what then happened was that the dating of these walls was like 1,000 years before Israel was even on the record. And so all throughout these archaeological digs, there were contradictory evidence emerged. And then in terms of dating and what was possible for sort of these stories of conquest. And then alongside it emerged this new narrative that it appears that the origins of the Hebrew tradition, soon to become the Israelite tradition, was really a movement that happened at the collapse of a Bronze Age empire. That there was a major collapse of the civilization that was ruled by Egypt right around, let's say, 1200 BCE. And this created a lot of turmoil in the region. There was great socioeconomic injustice. There was migrating peoples, power struggles. And just recently, in the past 10 years, botano archaeologists discovered that one of the reasons for this upheaval was a climate change. So now you have climate change, economic injustice, empires collapsing. Starts to sound a little familiar if we look across our own landscape. And out of that sort of culmination of events, groups of people start leaving the power centers, these city-states, and they start going up into the hills, into the highlands of what is now Israel and Palestine. And they started creating new communities. And these communities were done in a self-conscious way of setting up shop differently than what they were experiencing in Egyptian rule. And so this meant these villages were, some scholars say, egalitarian. That is way more equal in terms of not a steep hierarchy of class where wealth wasn't hoarded by a few, but wealth was shared. Other scholars think it was more of a heterarchical organization, meaning there was some differences gender-wise or between peoples, but it was sort of shared. Power was shared across different spheres. So whatever the exactness of these communities were, what we do know is that they were really different than sort of the harsh conditions, the unjust conditions that these folks were experiencing under Egyptian rule. And so you have sort of this miraculous emergence of new communities sprouting up from 10,000 people to nearly 100,000 in just a short period of time of around 150 years. And a new cultural identity, a new ethnic identity starts to take shape across these communities that becomes known as Israel. And so during this period, these folks were living differently, were challenging empire. And the key point here is they remained relatively untouched by the power structures. And so they were able to thrive during this time. And really, because if you think about how Egypt was sort of ruling that time period, even though they were on the collapse, was with horses and chariots. And so you can think of Ben-Hur here or something that horses and chariots weren't that good of going into sort of rocky highlands. And so there was really nothing much Pharaoh could do about these new communities. They couldn't get up there. And as long as the communities weren't sort of antagonizing empire or stopping trade routes or whatnot, there really weren't that much of a concern. And so these folks were able to survive and thrive for around 150 years. And then you start to see things change as different groups are migrating. And here we kind of hear about the Sea Peoples or the Philistines, who were sort of a warring group that migrated, now folks think, because of climate change. And they weren't dependent on horses and chariots. They could actually march on up into these highland regions and start to provoke, and military action was taken. And so that starts to spurn sort of this question of, do we want a king or not, within the Israelite tradition? But I'm going to stop there because that was a lot of ground to cover.
Well, what was fascinating to me in this, there are all kinds of little, hidden, they're not hidden, but these surprising kind of insights or theories or moments that occur in your book. And one of them is, on the one hand, you're sort of, kind of undermining this canonical story that we're so familiar with, and the foundational story of Israel, which was the Exodus and the escape of the Hebrew people from slavery. And yet you're suggesting that among these people who were sort of on the margins, who had kind of escaped from oppressive Canaanite city-states or from the empire, and had found this kind of safe space. And as the Egyptian empire began to wane and withdraw, they kind of flipped this story, and it be still a story of deliverance, but really sort of Egypt leaving Canaan rather than the Hebrews leaving Egypt exactly. And so this group becomes unified not so much around a cult of Yahweh, but around a story of liberation and freedom. So there's this echo there of the actual kind of Exodus narrative, but it occurs in a very different kind of context.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And this was really surprising to me. One of the things that archaeology has done for the Bible is, on one hand, it's contradicted stories like the Conquest narrative. But on the other hand, it's provided a really rich sort of framing and deeper understanding of a story like Exodus. And as you're saying, some folks really pick up on this idea from what's known as a cultural memory studies approach. And that approach says, when groups of folks come together, especially when they're dealing with some sort of perhaps trauma or cataclysm, that very often they story their experience. But the story isn't literal per se, that like, I personally experienced this and I left this harmful thing. It becomes sort of a collective conglomeration of the whole group's experience. And so scholars look at this time of the sort of the collapse of the Egyptian empire, this emergence of new communities. And the idea is that, the Exodus story tells all of the stories of those highland settlers, they all, in essence, left Egypt for a new start in the wilderness. That this would have very likely seemed like divine or miraculous experience, because if you think about it, these city-states that probably seemed just completely immovable were suddenly starting to collapse because of climate change, because of droughts, because of invading sea peoples and whatnot. And so this was probably for folks literally living in the hills and looking down on this stuff saying, wow, this is a miracle. We never thought we'd see Egypt leave. We never, look, these are plagues. This is a drought. And so these stories became a collective narrative of freedom, of liberation from Egypt. And we do tend to be kind of literal in the sense of like, Egypt is the Nile Delta region. And so when we think that the Canaanites or the Israelites were leaving Egypt, that they were leaving from that specific region as the Bible states it. But really, if we kind of expand what was happening around 1200 BCE and before, all of Canaan was part of Egypt. Egypt controlled that area. So folks leaving Egypt really they were leaving these Canaanite city-states that were controlled by Egypt. So everyone really was leaving Egypt, even if they weren't leaving that specific Nile Delta region that sort of gets codified in the way that the story was written down.
Well, that leads to the next kind of question. Where does the conquest story come from?
Yeah, so, you know, the question really is, if Israel's emergence was through this indigenous origins movement, which is what it's known, one of the theories that's known in biblical scholarship right now talks about this emergence of the Highlands settlements as an indigenous origins model of Hebrew origins. If that's how the Hebrew folks came into being, why then the conquest narrative? The archaeology shows that these were not a militaristic people. There's no weapons. There's no sort of walls of fortification. That these were homesteaders. These were farmers. They built farmhouses. They built unfortified villages to keep their livestock and children in, but not to keep out a militaristic force. So how did these folks suddenly become peoples of conquest? And to really understand that, and this is the key where biblical scholarship comes in, you've got to zoom way out. If I had a timeline with us, I would show right here is the start of the Hebrew Highland settlements. We're looking at 1200 BCE, okay? You've got to fast forward about 500 years, 640 BCE. So there's a lot of life happening here, a lot of things happening in the region before we get to what a majority of scholars think might be the invention or the first draft of the conquest narrative. So we're talking 500 years later, very different socio-political context. You can actually read about that context if you turn to 2 Kings chapter 22. That will thrust you right into the world of King Josiah and Judah and Jerusalem at that time. And what you see is a group of folks that have been now terrorized and traumatized by the Assyrian Empire for over a century. And so back here, when the Hebrew Highlanders started, there was no such thing as the Assyrian Empire. But 500 years later, you see the rise of the Assyrians, some of the worst and most horrific of empires rise up, and then they start to dominate this tiny place of Israel and Judah. And in 722, Israel is conquered by Assyria, the northern kingdom, and you have this influx of refugees coming down into Jerusalem and Judah. You simultaneously have an influx of Assyrian cash, if you will. For the first time, Judah is on the map as someone who can provide luxury goods and olive oil to the empire. And so you see an influx of Assyrian cash into the region at that time. And when sort of the rise of wealth happens, there can start to be a rise of different interests. And so scholars argue that it was during this time that a group of people sort of alluded to in the Bible in 2 Kings 22 as the people of the land or the Deuteronomists. Some argue this was sort of a wealthy elite class that emerged, and they deposed King Ammon, and they put young King Josiah on the throne at 8 years old. And it's believed they did that so that they could have sort of their own interests on the throne. And they realized, in part because of practices that were learned by the Assyrians, is kind of one that you talked about earlier today, Orwellian in a sense, that who controls history controls the present. Mm-hmm. And so if you're trying to, and these scholars argue that these folks were trying to create Judah into an imperial power, if you will, someone who had, could finally push back against folks like the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians. And so to do that, they really needed to create themselves in the image of empire. And so they went upon a very big, what I call in the book, rebranding effort, borrowing from my marketing experience, but really an attempt to rewrite history in a way that cast Israel's history as an empire, as a mini empire. And to do that, they really needed to go back into their history and say, we didn't emerge as peaceful folks who had been pushed around by empire and then tried to do something new, peaceful. We actually were just like the empire. In fact, our God Yahweh called us to be just like the Assyrians, to go in and conquer this land, and that God had our back on it. And what this did essentially is sort of create an identity and an ethos of empire to help support the nationalistic dreams, the imperial expansion dreams of the Judahites in around 640 BCE. And that's when that story, that's when that story, many folks think, emerged during that time.
Well, it's a fascinating story, or account of the way that a community is formed by the kind of story that they tell, or the memory, the national memory that they have. Whether it was in the case of the people who became the Hebrews or people of Israel through this story or memory of, or myth or whatever, of the Exodus, that describe a kind of experience of liberation. And then this kind of gets flipped over later with a reinvention of a story that's not about kind of liberation from power, but of mimicking the power of an empire, of the Assyrians.
Yeah, and it's really you can get narrative whiplash if you start in Exodus and you start reading about sort of this miraculous escape from Egypt. And then you end up in the Conquest, where you have this God who has heard the cries of the oppressed, has heard the cries of the Hebrew people oppressed in Egypt, and said, I'm going to liberate these folks. To then suddenly this same God in the next book saying, hey, guess what? We're now conquerors. We're going to oppress and do horrible things to the Canaanites. And so it's like, what happened in these sort of short span of texts? And so we've now been able to sort of parse out, where did these stories come from? Where did these different paradigms really come from? And then they got stitched together in sort of this unified narrative where the beginning is Exodus, the end is Conquest. But if we can start to parse out these different paradigms and say, okay, the Exodus paradigm came way back here in sort of the Hebrew Highlands settlement period, and then the Conquest paradigm doesn't come about until 500 years later, and you can understand where these two came from. We don't have to read them as just sort of the singular narrative. We can sort of see them and place them and understand them as two very different origin stories. It's not one long story. They're two separate origin stories that get sort of melded together, stitched together as one story.
Well, once you've begun to unstitch them a little bit, go back to this. What do we do with this? How does this affect the story that we tell ourselves today?
Good question. How much time do we have? Well, first of all, I'll say this. None of this would really matter except for the fact that these stories lie at the heart of the biblical faith traditions. And because of that, these sort of stories of that are coming from the Iron Age really wouldn't have much of an impact today, except for the fact that these stories are still very much alive and well. And the fact of the matter is, the three biblical faith traditions in many ways still shape their identity from these stories. And so stories, and especially origin stories, where we come from, why we're here, are really important for shaping identity. And these stories very much still do that. You can see how impactful the Exodus story is for sort of our Jewish siblings, how it's really a focus of the Seder, of identity. You can see how the Exodus story really helped shape the identity of enslaved folks in America, in terms of a story of liberation, that God hears the cry of the oppressed, and that the Exodus became a foundational sort of origin story and narrative for the abolitionist movements, for enslaved people's liberation themselves, for seeing themselves in the story. And unfortunately, the conquest narrative has had a long life of giving identity shaping to Christians in general, imperial Christians specifically, as a identity former to say, hey, guess what? All of the world is essentially Canaan, and any indigenous people we encounter are essentially the Canaanites. And guess what? We as imperial Christians are the new Israel, and God's calling us to come in and take the land. And I write specifically to a U.S. North American context, is specifically looking at how the story of conquest has shaped European conquests of North America, and how that story continues to live on in sort of the myth of progress, manifest destiny, sort of the foundational myths of America. So it's like America gets its identity in many ways from the story of conquest.
Yeah.
And so to your question as to like, what do we do? It's a really big question. And I start to unpack it by first saying, I don't think it's enough for us as Christians, here I'm speaking to the Christian church, to just say, well, these are old stories. We don't agree with them. Biblical scholarship tells us that, the conquest didn't happen, so we don't have to worry about it. We're not reading the Bible as literal, so let's just move on. There's violent texts, they're problematic. Like, what I argue is that a hermeneutical approach to these texts isn't enough, because these texts have really powerful identity shaping. And so I think that something more needs to happen. And what I argue in the book is that we need to allow new stories to shape our identity. Because feminists and critical theorists of the last century have really said, look, we need new origin stories as humans so that we can kind of orient ourselves in the present differently. And liberative, sort of covered over, hidden histories where folks have been on the margins, pushing back against empire, pushing back against really oppressive forces. These stories can really have power to shape us now in the present, to work for justice. And I think this was sort of the impulse that Norman Gottwald wrote his classic book, Tribes of Yahweh. He saw that like the Highlands Settlement story had a connection to justice movements in the 60s. And he really felt that. And I follow in the lines of that and say, yeah, I think it's not just enough to push back against these biblical texts. We need to actually lift up this new story of the Highlands Settlements for what it is, this miraculous sort of justice movement that happened in the collapse of great economic oppression, dealing with climate change, that folks leveraged new technologies. They leveraged sort of a utopian impulse to create new communities, to live out differently. And that this story actually rests at the very origins of all of the biblical traditions. And like, what happens if we invite that story into our faith practice, invite that story to shape us as Christians? I can't speak for my Jewish or Muslim counterparts, but I wonder too, like, how might this story shape others? But so my call in the book is really, how can we bring this story into our liturgy, into our faith practices, and really invite it to change us? I don't know what the results will be. I mean, here it's sort of like pneumatological, like let the Spirit work through the stories and let's see what happens. But that's really why I wanted to write the book, was to free this story up, not just from the earth where it's been buried for a long time, but also from archaeological and biblical studies, which is very technical language. It's not that accessible, and really interpret this story and bring it forward from a feminist practical theological perspective and say, hey folks, what do you think of this? Like, let's tell this story. Let's let it shape us and see what happens.
Well, that's one of the things I found really encouraging and inspiring about the book, and very topical, as in the United States now we're seeing this battle about historical memory, how we tell the story of American origins. Some stories that are considered so dangerous and subversive that they can't be shared with school children, about slavery or racial history. Which is so relevant and has so many effects in our current life. So that the battle between the 1619 project that kind of centers the African American story and slavery in American history, versus what Trump called the 1776 project, which is a cleaned up, tidy, very white kind of story. So, but you do kind of make the argument that it is possible to change our stories, listening to different voices, marginalized voices. And even in scripture itself, I loved when you tell the story of Peter's dream and how suddenly, is a whole new way we're going to do things from now on. Where did that come from? Speaking of the Holy Spirit, maybe just refer to that a little bit, explain what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I use that reference from scripture itself to say, look, our religious traditions are always sort of on the traditioning move or on the are changing, are evolving all the time. We get new information. We bring that into our faith tradition. You see that exactly. Peter has this dream that like what he had thought was unclean is now clean. And so it's a really practical theology move to be like, okay, we're going to do things differently. We have new information. Let's shape our practice. Let's do something different. And so when we're talking about the biblical text, when we're talking about the way we shape our liturgical worship services, all of these things can sort of seem immovable, but the reality is they're changing, they're shape shifting all the time, and that we see that modeled in scripture. And so that's where, I like to use that example because it's like, we can do that too. What else can we, like, if we see that one of our stories is really problematic, how can we seek to change that?
And of course, you could say that's what the whole gospel story is about. Jesus not inventing a new religion, but foregrounding kind of an understanding of religion or faith that draws on mercy and care for the poor and the widow and orphan and that sort of thing, and justice, the poor, and rather than one that focuses on reestablishing the Davidic messianic kingdom or something like that. And it was difficult for his followers, to see what he was doing. He was telling a new story in a way, but drawing on these resources from that are part of the tradition. Well, since you gave a shout out, I want to hold up the book you mentioned, Norman Godwell's Tribes of Yahweh, which Orbis published in 1979. So we're coming full circle here. I can't believe how we were able to publish a book of over 900 pages back then. But you've written a much shorter book, and I hope that it will reach a very wide audience because it should be obvious listening to that this is fascinating, and fascinating, as I said, to people who might not think that they're interested in archaeology or biblical studies. It's very easy to read. You draw so effortlessly on wide range of scholarship, but you're really not speaking to an academic, professional audience, but to ordinary people like me. And I can say that it really opened up my eyes and will change my way of thinking about a lot of things. So thank you very much, Kate Common. Please read this fantastic book, Undoing Conquest, Ancient Israel, the Bible, and the Future of Christianity. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.